Donald Trump has vowed to take action if Iran were to hang its protesters.
You did say the U.S. would get involved if Iran started killing protesters.
Yeah.
They have, by the many thousands, according to reports.
Well, we'll see what that is. I've heard two numbers, but we'll see what that is.
Well, now we're hearing that they're going to start hanging protesters tomorrow. So it comes back to the question, have they crossed your red line, or has the line moved?
I haven't heard about the hanging. If they hang them, you're going to see some things that I don't know what where you come from and what your thought process is, but you'll perhaps be very happy.
What do you mean by that?
We will take very strong action. If they do such a thing, we will take very strong action.
And this strong action you're talking about, what's the end game?
The end game is to win. I like winning.
How do you define that in Iran?
Well, let's define it in Venezuela. Let's define it with al-Baghdadi. He was wiped out. Let's define it with Soleimani. And let's define it in Iran, where he wiped out their Iran nuclear threat in a period of about 15 minutes once the B-2s got there.
Of course, hanging is a brutal way of killing. And whilst the US doesn't do that, it's still ironic as Trump's... excuse me, let me start again. Of course, hanging is a brutal way of killing, and whilst the US doesn't do this, it's still ironic as Trump's administration is killing people, as we all saw from Minneapolis. Resident Renee Good was killed in cold blood by ICE. Now, with the US being concerned about the authoritarian government in Iran, maybe they should look at their own country first.
Several demonstrators outside an immigration building in Santa Ana were shot at close range by federal officers using rubber bullets on Friday, one of them in the face. Activists have criticized law enforcement officers involved in the immigration raids and deployed to protests for using excessive force on civilians.
We all know the West being concerned about the Iranian people has nothing to do with altruism, but rather another big opportunity for regime change backed by the US, just like in 1953. But it was this clip from Sky News in which the open racism on display is very revealing about how the West sees countries in the Middle East.
That threat of execution, the Times picking up on the face of Irfan Soltani, a 26-year-old, set for execution by Iran's regime on Wednesday, the first in response to the nationwide protests. And he's become, something of a cause célèbre because he looks sort of a Western, identifiable man.
He does. He looks like he could be somebody you walk past on the street.
Hey, look, we have to care. He looks white. He could be one of our own. Really astonishing stuff. Kieran, what are your thoughts on the way in which the legacy media have conducted themselves when covering these Iran protests?
I mean, it's the first time I'm seeing that clip. That is astonishing when they give themselves away so blatantly. The way that the legacy media is covering it is, as you would predict, it sees Iranians that are anti-regime. It considers them full-bodied, flesh and blood human beings with an emotional life and human rights. And of course, by comparison, in regards to the way that it has spoken about and reported on Palestinians dying and continuing to die in Gaza in the most barbaric, torturous conditions, it regards them as subhuman. I mean, there's no other conclusion to draw, is there? There's absolutely no other conclusion to draw. Palestinians dying means nothing to the media. And I don't want to go on a tangent too much about Palestine because we're talking about Iran, but it's particularly fresh for me right now, for all of us. We can see it in rude health, in vivid display, that the people in the streets toiling for, in some cases or in many cases, we can't quantify it, very legitimately, their own freedom, their rights. They are to be conferred with the status of hero immediately, only because they're on our side. It's the most unbelievably disparaging compliment that the media could possibly pay to these people risking their lives fighting their regime, because it shows them, or it suggests to them, to the extent that they're paying attention, which they're probably not, that they are just deployed as pawns in a game of Western statecraft. And when they're useful, they will be treated as human beings. They will be reported as heroes. And as soon as they're not useful anymore, nobody will be paying any attention, certainly not the Donald Trumps of the world. And we saw the same thing in Iraq. I'm sorry to say, the Kurds. I'm old. I'm very old, Curtis. I'm old enough to remember the build up to the war in Iraq quite clearly, and I can remember for 6 months in the run up to the war in Iraq, run up to March 2003. I've never seen so many Kurdish Iraqis on TV before or since, and I don't say that to be, I don't know, performatively glib or something. The Kurds in Iraq have been treated absolutely abysmally by Saddam Hussein. There's no question about that. But they were trotted out onto television thinking that they were going to get an independent Kurdish state. They were used by the legacy media. They were used by the neoconservatives. And then, of course, when everything started to descend into quagmire, when everything started to go to shit, nobody talked about the Kurds anymore in Iraq. They were simply trotted out for that reason. And I'm afraid that the demonstrators in Iraq, without a credible plan, without something that ensures Iraq doesn't become a failed state with 92 million people in it, the same is being done to the protesters in Iran now.
It's fascinating to watch because you're seeing many right-wing figures. Again, I'll bring up Tommy Robinson, who is suddenly, fighting the cause for Iran. And you're seeing the same people speak up for Israelis and speak up for Iranians. Now, of course, I believe they're two very different reasons, right? One of those, of course, is ethno-nationalism. Of course, a lot of people on the right like the policies of Israel and want to copy them and bring them over here. But when it comes to Iran, it's not necessarily race superiority for Iranians. I mean, these are brown bodies. And let's be honest, when it comes to the far right, they hate them. But it's about Western imperialism. And it's very fascinating to see, quite in plain sight, in which Western foreign policy, particularly US foreign policy, is so brazen and so obvious. I was speaking to someone about the Iranian protests when it first sort of broke out again. I know it's been happening for a long time, but when it first broke out again, and they said, I'm kind of happy that Trump is so obvious because at the end of the day, you know your enemy and it's easy to fight against rather than some sort of soft power covert operation. It's like, international law doesn't matter. But I do find it very interesting that you have the right wing jumping on Iran. And of course, they don't care about the people there. And the way in which the media, I think, talks about this is very black and white. The corporate media works on sound bites. It's about 5-minute conversations. There's no nuance. And you have to pick a side. You're either a Western puppet or you love, regimes and dictatorial regimes.
Right.
Of course, both can be true. You can support the pro-democracy movement in Iran, speak about the human rights abuses, whilst also not wanting Iran to be a pawn of US hegemony.
Quite right, and also not wanting Iran to descend into failed state quagmire. I mean, there's a very real danger of that, and the danger is exacerbated by the types of personalities, as you rightly allude to, Curtis, that are lining up to support Iran now. Nigel Farage, Tommy Robinson, Donald Trump, whoever else, Marco Rubio, these people are the jackals of jackals. They do not give a flying fuck about another human life. They don't care about each other or their closest out. Really, they care about them to the extent that they bolster their power. They care about absolutely nothing. And so the idea that these people are going to be there when the going gets tough, as it inevitably will in Iran if the regime is decapitated. And again, like you just eloquently said, it is absolutely possible to support pro-democracy movements inside Iran that are genuinely grassroots and, deplore aspects of what the regime has done to its people over the years, while also acknowledging the realpolitik, which is that, failed states, a regime change, they have got a very, very troubling track record. And Iran is a very, very complex country. And so I can't see that ending well right now. It's possible that the demonstrators agitate and through agitation, they gradually weaken the Iranian regime, and that leads to, I don't know, a wellspring of power competitors to the Iranian state that have the wherewithal to take the machinery of the state, to take Iranian institutions into the end of the decade, the next decade, or whenever this happens. It's possible that process is underway, and it's possible that it kind of becomes stronger, but we're not there yet. It's obvious that we're not there yet. No serious analyst of Iran says that that's the case. And so regime change, even from within, it seems to me, would lead to a power vacuum.
Quite right. And I think as well, many people in the media seem to think that, okay, maybe it's not ideal that Western forces are, sort of instituting regime change, but you're going to get better human rights. I think a lot of people on the ground who don't immerse themselves in this politics might think that too, but that's not always the case. In fact, often, even when US coups happen, it's brutal for the people. I mean, if you think about, again, 1953, the CIA-backed coup, it was a brutal regime up until the Iranian Revolution. Of course, obviously, the Iranian Revolution wasn't a fully progressive. It didn't turn out to be a fully progressive society, but it was fighting against a CIA diktat. When you think about Chile, you had the socialist Allende bringing in amazing social reforms, reducing child poverty, using the state for the good of the people, and then a CIA, a US-backed coup in Pinochet turned it into a dictatorship, and it was brutal for the people. So I think a lot of people get in this trap. There's like a false dichotomy here, whereas like, okay, well, it's not ideal that America or the West has to take over, but, Western values and all that, maybe that's better for the people. Are you sure about that? I don't think it's particularly good when it comes to Venezuela, when they want to use and plunder the resources. When it comes to oil, for example, they're going to treat their people well, because when the people rise up, look, people are not happy. When Maduro was kidnapped, those that didn't even support Maduro, like, we don't want a American-backed government. I've just actually had some breaking news from my producer on the story. The government have temporarily closed the British embassy in Iran. This is amid rising tensions. This will now operate remotely, so Foreign Office travel advice has now been updated to reflect the consular change. So we've got some new information there. Did you want to have a final words before we wrap this one up?
I think it's important that you talk about the violence that could emanate from it. When I say failed state regime change, I sort of assume that's implicit, but it's right. You're right to make it explicit and highlight it. The fact that Reza Pahlavi, the son of the last Shah, also called Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the fact that he is being proffered, he's being foisted forward as the best hope of a successor to a decapitated regime, further underscores for me how unserious this entire thing is. However serious some of the people who are losing their lives, and let's not forget that, I don't want to, be disparaging about them. The people that are losing their lives in earnest, toiling and fighting for democracy in their country, or for more freedom, or for less oppression, however you want to think of it. The fact that Reza Pahlavi is framing himself as their leader, I think, is hugely disrespectful to them, and it really does bespeak the unseriousness or unpreparedness, strategically speaking, of any kind of successor movement or regime. Reza Pahlavi's father, as you rightly said, Curtis, was brutal. He was particularly brutal from the sort of early 1960s onwards, but I think the key thing is that he only survived in power. There were dictators in the 20th century that were far, far more brutal than him. And there is actually an argument that when the Revolutionary Guard and the revolution looked like it was starting to germinate, he actually wasn't decisive enough. He wasn't violent enough, some of his critics said, right, in order to put it down. If he was being a really, Pinochet-style dictator, and I think there's some truth to that. He had been violent earlier on, and he had been very oppressive. But I think for me, the key thing is not so much he was a brutal dictator. He was to an extent. It's that he only lasted in power. He only existed artificially because he was propped up by the United States and Britain from the very beginning. And when we say propped up, we don't just mean they said, don't remove this guy, he's our guy. They funded his secret police. In fact, they created an additional secret police force for him, which basically kept him in power artificially until 1979. And he was always totally deluded about his level of popularity. And the reason I mention that now is not just to talk about history. I see the same delusion utterly replicated in his son. His son, as a final thing, Curtis, in 1980, the year that his dad died, the year after the revolution, he died, the last Shah, and his son, who was then 19, proclaimed himself the new Shah at the age of 19. The guy thinks he has a divine right to rule. He lives in Maryland. You know, he's got zero experience of the real world, let alone running a country as complex as Iran.